This is the story of Lot 16. On the 1st of November 2011, a Lot Polish 767 was to fly from New York's Newark airport to Warsaw in Poland. Before the plane left, a ground engineer carried out an external inspection to make sure that everything was okay with the plane. Soon after that, the crew arrived and the captain started his external check, while the first officer started his cockpit check. They found nothing that concerned them, and the plane was deemed ready for flight. Early in the morning, the engines were started and the 767 taxied to the runway. By 4:19 a.m., the plane was airborne. As the plane climbed, the pilots retracted the gear and the flaps, but as they did so, hydraulic pressure in line C dropped. On large jet, the huge control surfaces are moved by using hydraulic systems. Think of it as the lifeblood of the airplane. You lose your hydraulics and you're pretty much paralyzed with very little control of your airplane. But this was just in hydraulic line C, and they had multiple lines, so nothing to worry about there. After consulting the quick reference handbook and the operator manuals, the pilots and ground controllers came to the conclusion that it was safe to continue the flight on to Warsaw, and that's what they did. With the decision made, they left New York behind and headed out into the Atlantic. The pilots knew that they wouldn't be able to drop the gears normally when it came time to land, because hydraulic line C had barely any pressure inside it. Instead, they'd have to do a gravity drop. And that's exactly what it sounds like. You open the gear doors and then just let the gears drop down and lock under their own weight. Good old gravity at work. The pilots were not too worried about this as they had done this multiple times in the simulator. The first officer, with a lot of time on his hands, started to plan the landing sequence. He didn't want to be caught off guard during the landing. In a couple of hours, the 767 was approaching Warsaw. The pilots were going through the steps to drop the landing gear. Then came the moment of truth. They commanded the gear to drop. But nothing. Things weren't going the way that they wanted it to. They thought that they had done something wrong, so they went through the steps again. But attempt number 2 failed as well. They had no landing gear. As soon as they found that out, they went around. During the go-around, they realized the seriousness of the situation, and they declared an emergency. ATC put the pilots in touch with experts as they attempted to troubleshoot the problem while the plane was in a hold. The experts on the ground wanted the pilots to cycle a few circuit breakers just to see if that would extend the gears, but it did not. In the meantime, a Polish F-16 was scrambled to intercept and inspect the plane. The F-16 did not have good news. The gear was still locked and up. I imagine that the pilots had this small sliver of hope that the circuit breakers had actually worked and their gauges were just broken, but that wasn't the case. The pilots were now out of options and running out of fuel. Their decision had been made for them. They'd have to land on the runway without the landing gear. Once ATC was told about the pilots' intentions, airport fire trucks foamed 3,000 meters or 1.8 miles of the runway. On the airplane, the pilots weren't taking any chances. They told the cabin crew to initiate an evacuation the moment that they stopped on the runway. Usually, you need the all clear from the pilots to start an evacuation, but desperate times called for desperate measures. With that, the 767 lined up. I imagine that it must have been a weird sight to see such a large airliner come into land without its gear down. The plane then touched down, and sparks flew. The foam did a lot to prevent fire, but despite that, the right-hand engine still caught fire. The plane screeched to a halt, quite literally. As soon as the plane had stopped, the pilots began the evacuation of the 221 people on board. Everyone made it off the plane safely. Despite everyone walking away from the plane without a scratch, the same could not be said for the plane itself. The engines were damaged, the aft section of the plane was damaged, and even onboard components were damaged. To my surprise, the airline seriously considered bringing the plane back into service after necessary fixes. But ultimately, they decided to scrap the plane, as it would have taken way too much money to fix up a plane after what this plane had been through. The investigators of Lot 16 were lucky. They had the entire plane right there in one piece, ripe for the taking. So they ran a ton of tests on it. In the case of Lot 16, the center hydraulic line had failed, which meant that the landing gear would not extend in the normal way. But that's not what they wanted to check. You see, an airplane, at least the way I look at it, is one giant ball of redundancy. If something fails, you have something else to back it up. In the case of the gear, if the normal hydraulic extension system did not work, you had electric motors that would open the doors and cut the gear free, allowing it to free fall and lock into place. They wanted to know why that system did not work. In the cockpit, they found one circuit breaker in the open position, and it was Charlie 829 on the Papa 61 panel. Once they rigged the plane up for testing, they focused their attention on the Charlie 829 circuit breaker. This was the circuit breaker that sent power to electric motors that allowed the motors to perform the alternate extension of the landing gear. The circuit breaker was near the first officer and down low to the ground. When the circuit breaker was closed, the alternate extension system worked perfectly as intended, but when it was open, the alternate extension system did not work at all. But why were the pilots unaware of the open circuit breaker? Well, there's no warning or light in the cockpit when a circuit breaker pops. It's just something that you have to discover on your own when you run through your checklist and troubleshoot the problem. That still doesn't explain why the circuit breaker was open in the first place. Well, the investigators had a few theories. The first one was that there was a technical malfunction. Maybe too much power flowed through the circuit, causing it to pop, or maybe there was internal damage in the breaker itself. So LOT's aircraft maintenance services got to work. They tested the circuit breaker at their normal power rating. It worked just fine. Then they subjected it to power levels that were 200% of what it was rated for. And in this case, the circuit breaker popped, which is what it was supposed to do. They also took x-rays of the internal structure of the breakers to see if it had suffered any internal damage. But it was fine. This circuit breaker had no reason to fail. The next theory was that someone unintentionally popped the circuit breaker. You know that the circuit breaker was down low to the ground. Some airlines had expressed concern that someone could unintentionally pop one of the circuit breakers. Like, for example, someone could hit it with their shoe, or someone cleaning the cockpit could unintentionally hit the breaker, causing it to pop. This made Boeing come up with a sort of guard that protected the lower section of the circuit breakers from unintentional contact. But this guard was not installed on the 767 that was involved in the accident. But a question still bugged the investigators. When did the circuit breakers pop? Well, the pre-departure check asked the pilots to check all the circuit breakers. So if that was done correctly, then it would mean that the circuit breaker was disabled during some time during the flight. So they had no way of knowing exactly when the circuit breaker popped. But for everyone on board the flight, the manifestation of the problems caused by the failed circuit breaker could not come at a worse time. They had flown across the Atlantic with this issue, and they were tired after a long flight. The pilots weren't in the best situation to be receptive to stimuli. So, when something went wrong, it was hard for the pilots to reset and evaluate the situation objectively. But we still have one final question. Why did the center hydraulic system fail in the first place? Well, it was due to a kink. Well, in the plumbing system of the aircraft, that is. There was this flexible hydraulic hose connecting the central hydraulic line to the right main landing gear. That line broke. It basically drained the center line after takeoff. This was because the hose was bent in a weird way when it was installed. Since the hose wasn't designed to swivel, the installation put some stress on the hose. Now, each time the landing gear was used, the hose went through a pressure cycle, and with each cycle, the hose got weaker and weaker, until it failed on the accident flight as it took off. Now, this flaw could have been caught as this area is inspected every 6,000 hours, and the last inspection was in March of 2011. But the inspection turned up nothing, and the problem with the hose was never identified. Now, one of the biggest questions that I have about this accident was why they decided to continue on to Warsaw if they had a problem with the hydraulic system. Now, it's not too bad if you lose a hydraulic line, but going transatlantic is a bit of a risk if you ask me. What if you lose another line? What if the issue isn't isolated to the central line? What if it's a bigger issue? Well, the crew had the same concerns as well. So after takeoff, they got in touch with Operations Center, letting them know of the situation that the crew was in. The Ops Center told the crew that they should continue the flight while referring to the quick reference handbook. What would you do in that situation? Would you continue or would you return to an airport as fast as possible? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to watch another video, do consider learning about the A320 that was doing exactly the opposite of what its pilots asked it to do. Link on your screen right now. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.